We're good to go. Thank you.
As I said, I'm Paul Jasa, Extension Engineer, University of Nebraska. I apologize for not being there in person. I fully intended to, but I was at a meeting last Wednesday where there were six of us in the meeting. One guy said he had a cold. We think he had COVID because on Saturday, one of the six tested positive for COVID. On Sunday, two more did, including me. So I thank him for sharing, I guess. But so anyway, I appreciate you making this available for me to present from Lincoln here. We're going to talk a little bit about equipment and equipment basics. I know, say a shout out to David there in the audience. David said he wanted me to be there in person to demonstrate actually in the field. Well, that didn't quite work out, so I told Jennifer we'll do it via slides. Well, slides from distance is what it is. So again, when you think about the equipment, we think about how equipment's changed over the years. We've gotten different tillage systems out there, ranging from mower, plow, disc, chisel, and no-till. I'm a fan of no-till. I've been no-tilling for many years. I started working with no-till planters in 1978. I've been working with continuous no-till since 1981. We've got a set of plots at the Rogers Memorial Farm, and I'll show you some pictures from those later. But a lot of the pictures I'm going to show you are things that I learned from working with producers like yourselves. In the 1980s, I had a huge grant system that we went out and worked with about 50 producers a year. Can you take your soil, your management, your equipment? Can you no-till? And we compared it to what they were doing normally. And so a lot of people thought, well, I don't have a no-till planter. Turns out the planter's not the place you start. You start with thinking about uniformity every day of the year in the field. And as shown in this picture, look in front of the tractors. Uniform height of residue, uniform spread of residue. Behind the tractors, fairly uniform tillage on the tillage tools. But again, Mother Nature with no-till can actually be more uniform. And so again, that's why I want to strive for uniformity every day of the year. This is one of our fields already planted at the Rogers Memorial Farm into soybean residue. And a lot of people say, well, don't you have to run residue movers? I go, why? Right now, every seed is in the same soil moisture, in the same soil temperature, under the same amount of residue. That's going to give me my most uniform growth. That uniform growth will give me best yields. Also hiding in this picture is you'll notice there's no weeds out there. Again, when I started no-till in 1978, we didn't have Roundup Ready crops. In fact, Roundup was only $100 a gallon back then. So I learned to put down early pre-plant herbicide, reined in and activated, plant into a weed-free environment. And for moisture conservation, that's a plus. Now I had to have a brain transplant when we started learning about cover crops and planting green. I'll talk a little more about that later. But again, when it comes to uniformity, where did the combine run the year before harvesting these soybeans? Again, if you can see that in your field, no-till is going to be a little bit more of a challenge. You want uniformity every day of the year. And in the old combines, we had a bat spreader in back and had narrow heads. The bat spreader worked fairly well, get the residue spread out. People didn't think too much of that little pile of residue there on the axle. I didn't think too much of it either when it fell off and plugged up the drill, the fertilizer bar, the planter, whatever. This is not a no-till drill problem. This is a residue handling problem. Residue needs to be handled every step through the system. Spread the residue at harvest time, you avoid problems like this. So again, it's a systems approach. We got to think ahead so you don't screw up the next step. And so when it comes to the bat spreaders, we've got a lot of people went to choppers. They like the chopper because it breaks the residue open, gets it exposed to soil microbes, gets the residue breakdown sooner. I hate the choppers. I've had no-till so long, my soil biology is so active, I don't want the residue broken open. We don't run a chopper at our Rogers Memorial Farm. Now, shown here, though, there's no chaff spreader on this combine. There's a windrow of pods there, then there's a strip without pods, then there'll be another windrow of pods. And when it comes to uniformity next spring, that's going to be two different soil temperatures, two different soil moistures. So again, in platform head, you need to spread the chaff as well. We do spread our chaff. We don't run a chopper, but we do spread our residue. And again, it used to be you had to go to aftermarket companies. This is a company out of Canada called Straw Storm and Chaff Storm, where it's pulverizing that residue, getting spread the full width. You'll notice there are no windrows there. The chaff and everything is spread. That makes no-till a lot easier. A nice uniform height of residue. And again, you used to have to go aftermarket. The good news is companies are now responding. Here's John Deere's Power Board where we can spread. If you pay for the extra option, there's even a version where you can speed up one side, slow down the other side to throw into the wind or not as much with the wind. So again, industry's responding, but we as consumers need to put the pressure on them that we need that. And again, when it comes to wheat harvest, the Shelbourne stripper header is fairly popular out in western conditions. We see some here in the eastern end of Nebraska and Kansas. But again, we're just plucking the kernels off the or berries off the top of the wheat plant, and that combine then is basically just a big seed cleaner. We leave the residue anchored and attached. And a lot of no-tillers really love that. It really speeds up their harvest, leaves that residue out there, anchored attached. Now, this is a friend of mine out in western Nebraska, irrigated wheat, out there planting with an old John Deere 7000. He says you'd be amazed how easy that is to plant through when that residue is anchored and attached. The worst thing you can do is cut residue loose or mat it down. Then we don't have the air movement. So again, we got to think about leaving that residue as uniform as possible, anchored and attached. Now, back to our Rogers Memorial Farm, we're not quite that big. We're got terrace systems that were designed for 15-foot equipment, 6-row. And so to fit our terraces, we only have a 15-foot head here. But again, you can see we aren't running a chopper. The straw comes out full length. And that settles down pretty good. We plant covers into all our wheat stubble, and that's not even a bother for our drill when we do that. But when it comes to no-till planting into that, again, anchored attached is one of the keys. If it's standing up, you don't have to cut it. And if it's standing up, you get air movement down to the soil surface such that after a quick spring rain, that soil surface will dry out. If I had a mat of residue on the ground and get a quick rain, it might not dry out into that mat for a couple of days. So again, for equipment-wise, leave it as tall as you can, anchored and attached. Now for corn harvest, we don't need a chaff spreader. There's very little chaff coming out. We don't really need a chopper if the corn head is doing the proper job. If you look closely at this, this producer, when I took this picture, he had a 7 pivot average of 265 bushel corn. Those are 18 20-inch rows going through that big combine on 265 bushel corn, and that's all the residue is coming out the back. It's just the husks and occasional tassel coming out the back. So your corn head is what processes the residue when it comes to corn harvest. One of the worst things I've seen is where people put a corn reel on their combine. There's no grain on that stalk, no reason to push the stalk through the combine. Get your corn head tuned up to get it processing the residue. And when I say tuned up, one of the things I look at is the snapping rolls. This is on a combine that had intermeshing snapping rolls. This is about 90 bushel dryland corn residue day after harvest. And the intermeshing snapping rolls don't let the corn stalks between the snapping rolls. Thus, they're leaning over. Now, this producer has a 6-row combine, has a 12-row planter. The pass closest to you there is leaning to the left. The second pass is leaning to the right. As you start planting down that with a 12-row planter, the first half works fine. The second half, you find every loose hose, wire, cable, chain on that planter. Something as simple as combining 2 passes the same direction, such you plant the same direction the stalks are leaning, makes that a whole lot easier. And again, systems approach, think ahead how things fit together. Now, here's a producer I met down in Kansas. He says, well, I just put a lean bar out front. Lean that residue over such that it doesn't catch the hoses, wires, cables, and chains. He added some extra weight there to get things to go on the ground. I'll talk about that later. He also has fertilizer behind where you can put on fertilizer, nitrogen, and he's got settle tanks in the tractor where you can put down a starter as well. When it comes to the one-pass systems, the broader your crop rotation, the more I like the one-pass system because you're going to be busy doing other crops. The narrower your crop rotation, and worst one we have in Nebraska is continuous corn, you've only got about 2-3 weeks to plant corn. You got about 2 or 3 months you could be putting on fertilizer. Why slow down the planter? And so again, think about how your system is fitting together when it comes to fertilizer, when it comes to machinery management, when it comes to the tenders working with you. Another producer in Kansas I met, he plants no-till into sunflower stalks. He put lean bars on his air seeder here, and you notice if you look close, it's actually filled with concrete just to make sure it's heavy enough to lean that sunflower stalk over. And a lot of people say, well, I can go out there and do a roller operation or a vertical tillage operation, knock that residue down. No, I want to knock it down when I'm planting because I want it standing up until then, such I get air movement down to the soil surface. after a planting, then that residue laying flat on the ground is going to help absorb raindrop impact, reduce erosion. It's also going to be a mulch to reduce evaporation. So again, flatten it at planting time or shortly thereafter. Another producer I know, big lean bar in the front of his John Deere 750 drill. And again, knock it over when you're planting. Now, this is one of our fields many years ago. We used to have a corn head that was pretty aggressive. And this again is right after planting or right after harvesting. Sorry. This is about 200 bushel corn. It's a little bit different than that 90 bushel corn as I showed earlier. Well, this was a combine with knife to knife snapping rolls. Those knife to knife rolls are too aggressive. They were chewing up the residue too much. Now, a lot of people like that. In the early days of no-till, and if you don't have soil biology, you'll like that as well. In the later days, when you've got soil biology, this is what our fields will start looking like in the spring. Again, that's over 220 bushel corn is due in this field. And when we chewed up the residue that much, put it in contact with the soil, our soil microbes ate it up. And so we've gotten rid of the aggressive snap and rolls. We are not looking to shred the residue with the combine. I don't like chopping headers either, because again, soil biology is what processes the residue, not mechanical and iron. So we got to think about that. And again, I showed you our silver seeder earlier. Here's our corn head now. It's got tapered snap and rolls. We run it up higher so the residue's standing taller. And again, those tapered snap and rolls are doing a good job of just snapping the ears off. And look how little residue's coming out of the back on over 200 bushel corn. It's just the husks and cobs coming out. So your corn head does your processing the residue for you. And again, standing residue is going to be important when it comes for snow catch. Again, uniformity every day of the year. Too often I see some fields that are blown free in some areas. The ground freezes deep. I got other areas where there's a deep drift. The ground may not ever freeze. And I got others that may look like this. Again, in the spring, that's 3 different soil temperatures, 3 different soil moistures. So again, uniformity every day of the year. Now, maybe I need a little help on uniformity driving here. A little crooked there on the rows. Now, let's switch gears to the planting equipment. And I sent Jennifer a handout. I hope she put it in your packet there about 4 key things to think about when you're looking at no-till planters. The first is going to be cut or handle the residue. Second is penetrate the soil desired seeding depth. Third is establish seed to soil contact. And fourth is close the seed V. Now, this is one of the farmers I worked with back there in the early 80s. This was his planter. And he says, well, yeah, I got no-till attachments. I can go no-till. Well, when it comes to cut or handle the residue, in the early days, everybody thought you had to put a coulter on to cut the residue. Well, a runner planter can't cut any residue. A coulter would do that for them, yes. When it comes to penetrate soil desired seeding depth, that coulter tilled and loosened that soil, and that lightweight runner planter could penetrate then as long as you had enough spring pressure on that coulter. Well, it tilled and loosened the soil. With that loosened soil, it's easy to get seed to soil contact. It was easy to close the seed V. I put tillage back in the system there, just not full width tillage. In fact, this is a newer planter. I use that word loosely. Those coulters are only 2 inches wide. The early ones were 4 inches wide and ran them about 4 to 6 inches deep. That was a strip tillage tool when they first came out. It's not a no-till tool. It's a one-pass tillage and planting tool. And again, when I started working with those farmers there in the late 70s, early 80s, they said, you're going to make me buy a Buffalo planter from Flesher Manufacturing. No, I think any planter, if you pay attention to those 4 steps, can be made into a no-till planter. Now, Buffalo ran a smooth, straight coulter out front to cut the residue, not a tillage coulter with waves. They had to do that because their slot shoe there couldn't cut any residue. Well, they just follow that coulter slot. Seed to soil contact is a press wheel right on top of the seed. Close the seed V was closing discs or closing wheels in this case, and then a harrow behind outside the picture to finish closing that seed V. And again, if you think of those steps, you can evaluate any planter, any drill, any air seeder out there in the market. Where do you need help? If you're going to buy attachment, will it fix the problem you have, or will it create another problem somewhere else? When it comes to cut or handle residue, I prefer to cut it. The double disc opener on the planter, it's got blade contact not at the bottom of the seed V, it's right up front at ground level. Those 2 discs work together to cut, open up that seed V, and that residue is nicely cut for you. Those 2 openers working together are sharper than any coulter I found on the market. And they're only running couple inches deep. They're not running 5, 6 inches deep like they used to run them. So again, it's easy to go with the double disc opener and go out there and no-till. Now those are side by side. Some stagger one in front of the other. It used to be Deutz Alice. Now it's the Landau planner. Case IH has stagger discs. Some drills have the stagger, one in front of the other. In my opinion, that's just marketing. They all work about the same. It's still a double disc opener working to cut the residue and open up the seed V. But there is a direct relationship to operating diameter and operating depth. The Deutz Alice planter here, those discs were 15-inch diameter. You can see on the scour there with residue and everything, it's got a good residue cutting angle when you're running about 2 to 3 inches deep. Now, if I had a disc that was only 12-inch diameter, like some drills have, if I ran 3 inches deep, I would be bulldozing residue. Contrary the other way around, if I had a disc, say 24-inch diameter on some fertilizer bars, and I tried to run 1 inch deep, it would push the residue down rather than cut residue. So again, we got to think about what our equipment is actually designed for. Now, those farmers I worked with there in the 80s, this is one of the producers I worked with, and he says, I love planting down the row. I do too, because that's where I did not drive last year. Now, he loved putting every seed in last year's stump. And a lot of people say you can't plant in the old root ball. I agree. You don't plant in it, you plant through it. If you plant through it, that seed's in soil. Anybody who's dug up a corn plant knows what I'm talking about. The seed is below the root ball because it comes up to the coleoptile and then it hits daylight or infrared light actually, and it sets your nodal roots up there. Now, I can't drive this accurate, and to be truthful, for corn on corn, we plant beside the old row. But he said his corn, these new roots follow the decaying roots. There's less soil resistance. The decaying roots release nutrients feeding the new roots. And that row is never going to wash out or it's never going to erode or crust. So again, there's an advantage of planting down the old row. So when it comes to those 4 steps, the second step, penetrate the soil desired seeding depth, is where we really need help. If I saw a failure back there in the 80s, the planters were simply too light and the springs weren't heavy enough to transfer the weight. I showed doubled up springs here on a deer. This package was 90 pounds each, so double up be 180 pounds per row. Is that enough? It might be. Depends upon your soil conditions. And it comes down to you want enough penetration force such that the depth gauge wheels are firm contact with the ground, truly gauging planting depth. The John Deere earlier, the double up springs. Here's a white with double up springs. White at that time in the Seed Boss, the 5000 series, had colder up front and had light duty springs. That colder cut and loosened the soil such that those light duty springs were enough down pressure. White has since beefed up their opener discs on the 6000, 8000, and 9000 series of planters, and they don't need the colder anymore. Their spring package now is about 450 pounds of available down pressure with the 4-spring option. So again, we got to think about, do we have the springs there to pull that planter unit down to the ground? But at the same time, we got to do a math problem. As the springs are pulling down on the planter unit, they're pulling up, taking weight off the toolbar. Now, this is an extra set of springs here. That's Sukup ridge gliders up front, clearing the ridge in a ridge till system for irrigation. They're looking for 200 pounds per row. The heavy-duty down pressure springs in this deer planter, we're looking for 300 pounds per row. 2 plus 3 is 500. 500 times the 6 rows is 3,000 pounds. And that planter toolbar did not weigh 3,000 pounds. It's lifting it up off the rock shaft. So again, we got to start thinking about how many things do we got going on the ground, how many springs are there, and do that math problem. Now, the good news is on the larger planters now, there's a lot more built-in weight. On the older planters where there wasn't as much built-in weight, that's where we had problems. And again, the older planter, White, holders on the toolbar. White says, well, put your front end weights off your tractor onto the toolbar to make sure they go on the ground. And this planter has a folding wing. Put some weight out on the wing too, such that it doesn't start folding up on you as the springs are pushing up. So again, get all that weight you need to get the penetration down to the desired seeding depth. Hit a new problem that I didn't have back there in the 80s. RTK and auto steer. We're buying planters without markers. Markers added weight to the toolbar. Central seed hoppers. We're carrying on 1/8 of a bushel of seed perhaps on each row unit. I like that fact actually because then your weight is constant going across the field on the row unit. What I don't like is those big boxes that John Deere had for a while that held 3 bushels of soybean seed. 3 bushels of soybean seed, the planter was 180 pounds heavier per row when you were full compared to when it was empty. How do you set that down pressure? Well, this with the central seed hopper there and only carrying an eighth of a bushel, those airbags can work a lot more consistently there. But again, we need some weight out on the end of the toolbar to make sure it stays in the ground. One of the worst examples I saw was a producer who says, "Yeah, I got my planter set for 2.5 inch corn planting depth." His middle rows, where all that seed and fertilizer is being carried, were going 2.5 inches deep. Out on the ends, with no weight out there, the airbags were lifting up the toolbar, and he was only planting about 3/4 inch deep. So again, get the weight distributed across the system. Again, the smaller planters had more problems. We got a John Deere Max Emerge, bought it in 1981 on the research farm. You can't see it there, but those fertilizer tanks are full of water just to make sure we got enough weight for that planter to go on the ground. You see a coulter on there. They came with coulters. We pulled the coulters off. The side view, we pulled off 5 of the coulters, left the 6th coulter on. And you can see that coulter is worn a little bit. It takes wear, tear, and abuse, and the disc opener still has this original bevel on. I can like a coulter in stony soils, sandy soils, abrasive soils. I hate a coulter in wet, sticky clays because that coulter running that deep, it's pretty shallow there, will still bring up wet, sticky stuff to ball up the depth gauge wheels. But the key there is the heavy duty down pressure springs in there. People ask how much down pressure I need. I say, I don't know. Check it. Go out a couple weeks ahead of planting time, get the planter when it's empty, as light as it's going to be, and blind plant some. Get the toolbar the right height so those parallel links are running parallel to the ground. And then check the depth gauge wheels. Are they in firm contact with the ground, or can you slip them? If they're not in firm contact with the ground, tighten the springs. Or if you don't have springs, that's why I do it a couple weeks ahead of time. I got time to go find some springs or find some cast iron to put on the row unit or something to get it to work. Now, conversely, if I cannot slip those depth gauge wheels, then I might have to reduce the down pressure so I don't overpack the seed V. So that means you got to check it as your conditions change through the planting season as well. Now remember, they're pulling down in the row unit, they're pulling up in the toolbar. Check the drive wheels of the planter so they don't slip. And again, that's outlined in that little handout that I sent Jennifer. Show you this planter, a friend of mine in Illinois. He was working with Yetter evaluating their triple coulter system. And when it comes down to it, the 2 coulters up front, put down some fertilizer, did some tillage. He had to put a residue mover on there to kick out the incorporated residue from the tillage. And then he still felt like he had to do some tillage to get the seed in the ground. But look in the front of that planter. There are 12 John Deere rear wheel weights across an 8-row planter. And it's not 8 rows, that is 32 openers going in the ground when you count all those coulters. And so again, we got to think about it. How much what do you have going in the ground? Well, the farmers I worked with, this is one of those from the early 80s. He says, don't even listen to Jasa. Hook onto your planter, go out there and try it. You'll be amazed what you can cut through. He's no-tilling here. He said, if I would have dissed that corn ear would have been planted, I would have had volunteer corn. Now, I should have pulled that one little green weed there before I took the picture. But he says, there's no extra attachments, no nothing there. It's the old 5x7 toolbar, and he's no-tilling since the early 80s, and he loves it. So again, we got to just check it for your conditions. Now, he's planting down the row, and some people say, well, plant between the rows, then the planter doesn't have to handle as much residue. If you do that, you notice the one row of previous residue is really flattened. You'll chew up your tractor tires real fast. We plant down the row, and that way we don't get our tire wear. The other thing is, by planting down the old road, that's where we did not drive last year, so I'm not planting in a compaction wheel track. And that's the most biologically active area in the field I have. So why not put this year's seeds in the biologically active area in the field? That's why we like planting with the old rows. So again, think about the systems approach. Again, on corn, I said we plant beside the old row. And this is a high yield pivot irrigated study where this is actually 44,000 on 44,000. And that's why the stalks are so close together as well as the plants are so close together. And we plant beside the old row. We just have the standard depth gauge wheels on the planter, we just sort of get it right up against the old row. Now, the one row is stunted a little bit because he's on the edge of the wheel track, but you really want to stun him, put him in the heart of the wheel track, and then you'll really chew up your tractor tires as well. Now, people say, well, what about residue movers? Well, I started no-till in 1978. Residue movers didn't hit the market until the mid 90s. And I had several companies say, well, try them, you'll like them. Well, the quick, easy ones are cheap like this. If you need uniformity in the field, they can be a plus. And here, for instance, the farmer I worked with there in the 80s, he has no-till corn into the soybeans, then he moved over a little bit and did soybeans in the corn residue. He's now in his second year of no-till. He's accumulating some residue, he's building some soil structure, but he doesn't need a residue mover unless he changed his planting direction and planted directly across the rows here. Then he would have some bare soil where the soil is drier and warmer. He'd have some residue covered soil where it's cooler and wetter. By kicking out that residue, it'd make it more uniform and his yields may go up. So again, if you need uniformity, I would rather change my system up front rather than do it with a planter. The planter is more correcting errors. For instance, if you didn't spread the residue properly or something like that. So make sure you're using the systems approach. And then again, here's a project we did where we used the residue movers a little bit too aggressive. We moved some soil, never move soil. But we said, well, it's early planted corn. We want to blacken that strip so it warms up, comes up quicker on the corn. Well, here in Nebraska, the wind blows. Some residue blew back. Yes, it was a black strip the day we planted. A couple days later, it looked like this. The corn's coming up. We had some corn coming up with no residue. We had some corn coming up through residue. We had some corn leafing out under the residue. And those conditions I just described was a less uniform stand. We actually find that our yields go down when we run residue movers because of the non-uniformity. I'd rather have uniform emergence. That's more important than uniform spacing. Now, in our research farm, we have several John Deere planters where we run floating residue movers with dip bands on them. Those dip bands help reduce that chance of moving too much soil. But for our general production on our Rogers Memorial Farm, we don't run residue movers. We just go, go out and plant. Excuse me, my COVID's coughing a little bit here. And again, residue movers, we don't use them. This is about, I think that year is 87 bushel wheat. And a lot of people say you can't no-till into heavy wheat straw. Well, if you have good soil structure from continuous no-till, that's not heavy wheat straw. That is a nice residue cover. This was soybeans planted about April 15th in an area of the state where our soybean physiologist says the soils aren't warm enough in tillsoils to plant until May 1. By May 1, I already had soybeans up and growing. So again, continuous no-till, well-structured soil, leave the residue there. Leave it more uniform. Let's get back to the planters. Cutter handle residue, I like the double disc openers. Don't really need to handle it, get it out of the way, because I hate cutting it loose. Penetrate the soil, down pressure springs and weight. Seed to soil contact, close the seed V. There's an oops. Right about in the middle of the picture there, you can see a corn seed. This is one of those farmers I worked with there about 1983. He had an old International 400 cycle planter. Good sharp acre plant runner on it. He says that sharp acre plant can cut a slot if I put some sand in the side hoppers. I got a good chopper in my combine. I don't have to worry about handling residue. I can penetrate the soil. That 400 cycle planter had about a 6-inch wide press wheel and back. Did not give him seed to soil contact. Did not give him closing the seed V. Now, believe it or not, it rained that night about 1 inch. That seed V silted in, and his replicated strips across the field, no-till that looked like this when he planted, compared to disc field cultivate, the no-till was 13 bushel per acre better. And he says, I got to get a different planter. So again, think about those steps. When it comes to closing the seed V, that is separate from seed to soil contact. Now, angled closing wheels like on John Deere here, or White, or Kinsey, they do both steps together, but evaluate them separately. If you look at these cast iron press wheels, people in the early days of no-till thought you needed the cast iron for more closing force. The cast iron press wheels were actually invented more for southern Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, where they were harvesting their wheat, double crop, dry soil, and they needed extra closing force to get seed to soil contact. They were not designed for no-till conditions in wet soils. The cast iron itself was too aggressive. The standard rubber tires work better. And I'll talk about some other closing options here later. But when it comes down to it, this John Deere planter, when it's designed, those cast iron or those angle closing wheels extend them downward. They intersect an imaginary point about 2 inches below the soil surface. If you're planting 2 to 3 inches deep, they work great. If you're planting shallower than that, say putting in beans at 1.5 inches or milo at 1 inch, they are packing below the seed, and you're not going to get seed to soil contact, and you may not close the seed V. So again, if you're using a corn planter to plant milo and beans, you're going to plant your seed a little deeper. Now, Dave always likes when I talk about planting depths. We plant our soybeans at 2.5. We plant our milo at 2. We plant our corn at 3.5. That's in well-structured no-till soils. And so again, get it down in there. The deeper you go, the more buffered the soil temperature is, the more uniform the soil temperature and soil moisture are, the more uniform your stands. But again, I underline in well-structured no-till soils. Now, what if I use these angle closing wheels and was planting milo 1 inch deep? It's packing below the seed. You're complaining about sidewall compaction. The sidewall compaction was not caused by the openers up front. If you're properly closing the seed V, you'll fracture the sidewall. This is caused by too much pressure on the packing wheels and back, packing below the shallow planted seed. And that's why we plant our milo down 2 inches at least, our beans at 2.5, so we can get good seed soil contact while we're closing the seed V. Key is evaluate them separately. If the seed to soil contact is already there, you do not tighten down the press wheels trying to close the top of the seed V, because then you will overpack things. You look at, are there other problems? And this, I admit, is in tilled soil, but one of the problems is if you have your planter running nose down, what happens then is you start bulldozing up front, and let me wake up my mouse here. In back here, this tail stock for your closing wheels is now tail down. That has to run level on your planter for your angle closing wheels to work properly. If it's running tail down like this, your angle closing wheels will not close the seed V. Yes, you'll get seed to soil contact, but it won't close the seed V. Now, if you put your planter level to a little bit tail down and back, that takes this pivot point down. That'll flatten out this, and you'll do a far better job getting seed to soil contact and closing the seed V. The other thing is if you're planting too shallow. If you're planting too shallow, this pivot point moves up, this tailstock moves down, then you will not be able to get seed to soil contact. Again, that was designed when corn planting depths were 2 to 3 inches. That's where that planter should be run. And here's a little demonstration I did. The 2 rows on the right, you can hardly see. That was planted at 1 inch deep. Now, in the field, you can actually still see the seeds. The next 2 rows on the left were planted 3 inches deep. That planter does a lot better job at 3 inches. Now, the last row, just barely visible up in the corner, was 2 inches deep. I had a 6-row planter, so I had 2 rows at 1, 3, and 2. And again, when it came to doing that, 3-inch performed way better. The 3-inch, the yield was better on the corn as well, because again, more uniform emergence, more uniform growth. Now, there's other options out there for closing the seed V. And a lot of people, when they were planting shallow and no-till, they says, well, I'm going to plant shallower where it's warmer and drier, and that seed will come up quicker. I don't want to put it down that cold, wet stuff down deep. Dwayne Beck says it the best. Don't worry about making planting time warmer and drier. Worry about making the rest of the season cooler and wetter. And so what I do is I'll make sure it's uniform. And so what if it's a little slower than the neighbors popping out of the ground? I want it uniform growing conditions. Now, this is some spoke closing wheels. This is actually on Howard Martin's planter years ago in a demonstration he had that I went to. He's got his row cleaners up front. And rather than just sell you one set of row cleaners, he sold you a second set to put his closing wheels on the back. Well, now out of the 4 steps of the planting process, he cut and handled the residue. Well, he's handling it. He's cutting it. Penetrate soil he was. And he took off the John Deere's rubber closing wheels that gave you seed to soil contact and close the seed V, and put on the spokes that only close the seed V. That's all right. Howard Martin was a friend of Gene Keaton's, and Gene Keaton invented the Keaton seed firmer to give you a seed to soil contact and then close the seed V. Nothing wrong with that concept, but if you bought just the spoke closing wheels and didn't put a Keaton on, you'd be sorely disappointed, especially in a dry year, because you won't have moisture moving in that seed. So again, evaluate the steps before you buy an attachment as well. Now, Howard Martin has got a patented system he calls the Martin till system. Even the spokes that he had was drying the soil too much, and his patent includes a drag chain behind. That drag chain is to harrow it sort of to smooth in those holes so it doesn't dry out as much. My experience, though, on silt loam soils and silty clay loam soils, that soil that you just tilled with those spokes and then you harrow it like that, crusting becomes a problem. And a no-till, usually crusting is not a problem when you get good soil structure and you have residue on top. And so most of the no-tillers I know don't run the drag chains, and they'll run less aggressive spoked cleaners or spoked closer wheels so they don't dry things out as much. And less aggressive. Right down the road from you guys there is Osage City. Keith Thompson invented the Thompson T wheel, sold by Exapta. The spokes are a lot shorter, they're self limiting on depth, and it gives them loose soil above the seed. And he's got a Keaton seed firmer hiding in there to give him seed to soil contact. But what Keith has is a what they call a shrink swell clay. You might close the seed be perfect the day you're planting. 3 days of a hot, dry wind and the soil dries and the soil shrinks, it opens back up. Well, that little bit of closing action there gave him loose soil so it doesn't open back up. Contrast that to Howard Martin. He had aggressive spokes because part of his patent was to till the soil to dry it out. He was in a 50-inch rainfall area in Kentucky. So again, before you even buy an attachment, look at who invented the attachment and what problem was he trying to solve. Shrink soil clay like Keith or too wet a soil like Howard? What are you going to buy? Now, what are you going to buy? I say look at who invented it, but when I count, my last count is there's about 38 different ones out there in the market. And so you just got to think about them. The Schlegel Posiclose wheels. This is a picture actually off of their display, and they're in sandier soil, and it collapses the seed V down around the seed, Keaton seed firmer in there to give them seed to soil contact. Sandy soils works great. In a wet, sticky clay, it becomes a solid wheel, or it's like a Play-Doh funding pumper and cuts little clay dice out there. And so again, who invented it for what problem? Or the copperhead furrow closers, supposedly non-stick poly. I got news for you. There's basically no non-stick poly out there, so I will still stick to that. But again, there's different ones out there. This was a little cheaper because you use your existing rim and bearings. You just put on a replacement of the tire. So again, think about what's out there. The one I have to laugh a little bit about is Yetter. Yetter has 4 different versions. If there was one best version, they'd only have one. Now, unfortunately, some of the other salesmen don't know where each one should be used. So again, be careful when you start looking at these. Or you get this producer. I'm too cheap to buy 2. I'm going to buy only 1. That one, the solid wheel on there, gives him some seed to soil contact. He's got the Keaton there to give him good seed to soil contact. But it also provides depth control such that Martin wheel is not too aggressive. So that's not too bad of an idea. We got a lot of planters in Nebraska that are set up this way. One spoke to give them the loose soil so the seed V doesn't open back up, and one solid wheel to give them some seed to soil contact and depth control. Now, unfortunately, if you know the Martin wheel, notice there's about 1.5 inches missing off of every one of those spokes. In your mind, draw those spokes 1.5 inches longer on the bottom there, and you'll see it's going to pick every seed out of the seed V. This producer took his cutting torch out and cut 1.5 inches off of every one of those spokes across his 16-row planter. It took him a while to do it, but it made it less aggressive, and he loves it. Here's a hint, guys. Read the directions. Here is the Martin wheel without cutting off the spokes, but you'll notice on the hub of the wheel, again, wake up my mouse here, right in here, there's a spacer. You need to space that wheel out such that it does not pick the seeds out of the seed V. So pay attention to how those wheels are mounted, how far are you away from the seed, how far apart are the wheels. So read the directions. And again, we got a lot of producers in Nebraska that run one of each. or one of each in this case on a 20-inch planter. He's got the Dawn curve tines. Notice these guys are not running drag chains. They're just running the solid wheel. It firms up the soil, and they get the loose soil there as well. Side view of another producer, a good friend of mine. Again, I'll come back here to show you the tailstock. Notice it is running level. That's what you want when you're in the field. He has a residue mover on the front of his planter. He's got it raised up just enough to kick out any piles if he has some wind drifting or if he didn't spread the residue. He's got a starter attachment out front to put down nitrogen. And again, it's to avoid the carbon penalty when it comes to high carbon cover crops or, say, planting into corn or wheat, stubble, or grain sorghum residue where you need some extra starter nitrogen. Then he's also got a little blue line hiding in there to get some starter down in furrow. But again, we got to think about how does the system all fit together. Now, come back to the Rogers Memorial Farm. This is our planter we used to have, an old 800 Cyclo. This is a planting date study I had where calendar date was circled and it was day to go out and plant. You notice there's some soybean stalks there are still long because we don't run the chopper. We're planting there, and it looks a little foggy out. A lot of people say we can't no-till when it's wet. Sure you can, if you have good soil structure, good sharp equipment. And this is about 8 in the morning. The interesting thing is it's foggy in the morning because it rained about 1.25 inches the day before. Now, planting dates today, I should have probably waited another day or two, but to keep on the research, I ran ahead and ran. The fun picture, though, is this one. That is some weights on there to make sure I penetrate the soil to get through that residue. But look at the depth gauge wheels. They are clean. They run on residue, not on the soil. If you had a coulter out front or a residue mover up front, those would be big mud balls. We very seldom get rained out of the field. Our target is to have our corn, beans, and milo all planted by May 1. And in some years, our conventional till neighbors hadn't even started yet because the soils are too sticky. We can run because we're running on top of the layer residue and we have soil structure. Now, there is a Keaton seed firmer hiding underneath there. And also we have notched closing discs on there so that our seed V doesn't open back up when the soil is dry. And yes, my press wheel is picking up a little bit, but the seed's already placed with the Keaton seed firmer and my depth control is uniform because I'm not mudding up. We upgraded from that 800 to a 900, and we've upgraded since then to a 955. We quit at that point because that's when Case quit doing the central seed hopper with the drum up front. Now, when it comes to what you guys are doing, it may or may not make a difference, but when we want to go out and do a variety plot trial, I can dump a plot bag of seed into that drum, put it on. Our tractor driver never has to get out of the tractor. He can plant the plot. I can dump out the drum, put another plot bag in. We can do 100 plots in an afternoon with that central drum. And so again, we got to think about your system. Hiding in the background there, you see there's a solid side irrigation system. There's a buried underground pipe with hoses coming up to each of those sprinklers. Well, one of those hoses broke off the sprinkler, and the planter operator thought it would just bounce out of the way when he hit it. Nope, we can cut water line. You think we're worried about cutting residue? So again, good sharp opening disc, good down pressure, we can do it. We have notch closers on. Here's a farmer I worked with. He only bought one notch closer for his Case IH planter. And he's got the little orange thing in there. That is a shaft rebounder. It is different than the Keaton seed firmer. As the name implies, we firm the seed with the Keaton. We stop the bouncing seed with the Shaffert. Get the rebound. To be truthful, they both stop the bouncing seed. They both get the seed to the bottom of the seed V. They'll both pay for themselves by getting a more uniform emergence. The original Shaffert rebounder mounted the seed tube. So the original Keaton, they now mount differently so they don't put stress in the seed tube. But again, the key is going to get the seed to the bottom of the seed V. I won't plant corn without one or the other on the planter, or there's some others showing up in the market now. And what it does is avoids this problem. Over there in the far left side, you can see a little corn plant. He's way behind his neighbors. Well, when we actually dug him up there, the seed was only about a half-inch deep, laying in dry soil, waiting for a rain when his neighbors were down 2 inches deep in good soil moisture. And so again, the uniformity of emergence will pay for those devices, put them on your planters. And it'll give you a better root system. The one on the left there, the seed was down about 2.5 inches deep. Good root system. There's an extra node of roots in the ground compared to the one on the right because that was too shallow. And again, if you put a Keaton or a rebounder on, that'll avoid this problem. And you can see the difference in yield where the money comes from. Switch gears a little bit when it comes to drills, box drills, air seeders, whatever. Same thing. Cutter handle residue, penetrate soil, seed to soil contact, close the seed V. Same 4 steps. I already showed you this. Divide by 4 when it comes to residue flow. Make sure you spread the residue at harvest time. Multiply by 4 when it comes to weight and down pressure. Rather than 6 rows on a 15-foot planter, on a 15-foot drill, it might be 24 rows. This was a demonstration we did about 1983 where they're pushing the tie stubble drill, and he started planting every soybean seed was on top of the ground. He tightened the down pressure springs in back. He says, I can get 300 pounds of down pressure. I said, 300 times 15 openers is 7,200 pounds. What's your drill weigh? And he goes, 5,000. Well, 5,000 pushing down and 7,200 pushing up. The drive wheel was about 6 inches off the ground. It took this many volunteers from the audience to be able to plant. Now, the good news is those dealers are not a problem anymore. They've either gone out of business or they've learned. And again, here's back the demonstration back there in the 80s. This dealer learned. A 3-point mounted drill had to be converted to pull type to handle the weight safely. But look how many weights he's got on there to get that marless drill in the ground. Or there's other companies out there that had a conventional drill and tried to make it a no-till drill by putting a coulter cart out in front. Just like I said on the planters, the coulter is a tillage tool. This is a one-pass tillage and planting system. If you really want to get into no-till, go to a no-till drill where it's beefed up and back to handle no-till. And for instance, here is the Great Plains version that is no-till. You see a lot more residue standing behind the drill, a lot more residue there. Off to the left side of the drill, that is a one-pass system of what they call a fluffing plant with a coulter caddy drill, and it basically discs the soil. And again, that's not no-till when it comes to erosion control, moisture conservation, and so on. So again, think about how little soil disturbance you can have. And what companies will do then is they'll go to the stagger disc opener, the hay buster or Vermeer drill had that. The money you save by not putting coulters on there, you can do bigger bearings, bigger discs, parallel links for better uniform depth control. And so again, we got to think about how it all fits together. Crustbusters, Sunflower, Landau all have staggered disc openers. And again, this is a Crustbuster drill we borrowed years ago. This is the one I showed you that was all plugged up. So that's when we were still learning how to spread residue. We didn't spread it good enough. You can see a little concentration of residue there in the middle. But again, when it comes to down pressure, with the number of openers there, you may have to add the weight. And when we bought our own Crustbuster, then we added weight. There's 20 suitcase weights there. We added markers because the markers and the frames added weight. We filled the beam under the drill box and the hitch full of flat steel to add weight. And we had to do that because that drill ship weight was 7,900 pounds. Their down pressure springs claim you can get 500 pounds per row. 500 times 24 openers is 12,000 pounds. Yes, we added over 4,000 pounds to that drill to make it work in all conditions. We replaced that 1996 model with one in 2014. We still have the suitcase weights on there. We still put the markers on there. Crustbuster ship weight now in that drill is 11,800. They fill those bars under the box and in the hitch with flat steel from the factory because they know they need the weight for no-till. And just like the planter where I can cut my water line, that drill I can cut water line as well. You can see the 7.5-inch spacing there by measuring across. But with the Crustbuster drill, a lot of people say there's too much soil disturbance. If you run the drill tail down, nose up, there's minimal soil disturbance. Again, here I'm planting wheat into freshly harvested soybean stubble. Working good there. Have to run the marker because we actually can't see where the rows were in some places. And you can see some extra weights across the walkboard and back. And again, the good news is on a lot of these bigger drills, there's a lot of frame weight being built in. You know, Sunflower drill out of Kansas, there's a lot of weight built in there. But you still may have to add more, do that math problem. Again, our Crustbuster, I like depth control in back. A lot of people say they like the single disc drills, but they have the depth control beside the opener. If you're planting soybeans in the spring, that's fine. It's going to flatten the residue. If you're planting wheat in the fall, I like to leave the residue standing to catch snowfall, keep the wind off the soil surface. Here I'm planting a cover crop into about 220 bushel corn residue. Here's wheat stubble already planted to a cover crop with that crustbuster drill. Again, the depth control is behind the opener, so it left all the wheat stubble standing. And I got a lot of farmers, especially those who are using stripper headers, say, why would I plant a cover crop? Because my air seeder knocks over all my residue. I say, you've got the wrong air seeder for doing cover crops. Again, I like the double disc opener with depth control behind. A lot of people say, well, the single disc opener works better. If it worked better, why wouldn't there be single disc openers for corn planters? Corn planting, which is really critical for good seed to soil contact, uniform depth, all double disc. And that's what we use for our drill. And again, here's that wheat stubble, cover crop coming up nicely. So that drill did a nice job. And that cover crop winter kills. And here's our 955 planter, again with some weight on there to make sure it penetrates. This is no-tilling into that cover crop into wheat stubble with no herbicide. When we plant that cover crop, as soon as the combine leaves the field, we get no volunteer wheat. When it winter kills, there's enough residue there that we don't have spring weeds or overwinter annuals. And so again, our cover crops have really reduced our herbicide bills. And again, the single disc opener, is pretty popular. A lot of people like it. They say it can cut a handle a lot of residue. Yes, but it can also flatten a lot of residue. And again, here's soybeans drilled with a single disc drill. And again, if you're concerned about spring planting and raindrop impact, maybe that's a good deal. Soybeans planted in the grain sorghum residue here. Or in this case, producer I know in Kansas who had cover crop into his wheat stubble that frost killed, and he's out there planting milo the next year. You can notice the starter fertilizer there, and he's using that drill basically as his cover crop roller to knock everything down as he's planting, such that he has a mulch there to reduce evaporation and reduce raindrop impact. So again, what is your function? On fall planting where I want standing residue, I like my double disc drill depth control behind. On spring planting, erosion control, maybe I want flattened residue. So what's your cause? What's your problem? If you have the double disc or single disc drill depth control behind or beside, you can switch out to narrower depth gauge wheel to leave more residue standing. Then you can also switch some openers. You switch half from the left on the front to half the left on the back. Now, if you sit there and draw it out in a drill, you'll figure it out. But what you can see here is on the front gang openers here, the depth gauge wheel, remember the drill's coming at you, is on the left side of the opener. In the back, the gauge wheel is on the right side of the opener. So it turns out the front wheel runs over residue, the back wheel runs over the same residue, but the rows are on opposite sides of the wheel track. This is actually Dwayne Beck's drill up in South Dakota, and he uses narrow depth gauge wheels. And rather than a 7.5-inch spacing, it's actually paired rows 5 inches apart with 10 inches of standing residue in between. And so again, if you need more residue standing, rearrange some openers, go to a narrower depth gauge wheel. Another thing to do on those single disc drills is look at the closing. Seed to soil contact separate from closing the seed V. Some people put the notch closers on, others don't. But what I will do is switch out to a narrower seed press wheel. John Deere's original one was about 1.25 inches wide because it was designed for tilled soil. It didn't give you enough seed to soil contact. So people were putting narrower wheels on. John Deere finally came out with a narrow wheel. They came out with only 3/4 inch wide. The narrow ones on the market are more like a 1/2 inch wide. And here's a comparison. On the left side here is the 1/2 inch wide. On the right side is the John Deere. It's wider. Got a spoked wheel versus solid wheel. It's got narrow depth gauge wheels on. So I asked the producer, I says, which one do you like better? Or which combination do you like better? He says, well, for leaving residue, he likes the narrow depth gauge wheels. For seed to soil contact, he likes the narrow press wheel. For closing in wet soil, he likes the spoked wheel. For closing in dry soil, he likes the cast iron wheel. And I'm like, why do you have some of everything on there? He goes, because I plant into everything. And so again, what is your primary thing you plant into? do you set yourself up for that? I know some farmers actually take the time to switch out uh, press wheels in back, for instance, the seed press wheel, not just when it's wet, cast iron when it's dry. So again, what are you willing to do? Again, when the 750 came out, everybody said, look how heavy that is. But even then, I could see people rotate the rock shaft too far, start lifting the wheels off in the ground and back. A lot of people say that's no problem because the drive wheel's pivoting. No, if the tail is coming up, you're losing seed to sole contact, closing the seed V. You may have to add some weight in the back. And that's where John Deere has the weight bracket back there. If you're working on side hills, especially with the air seeders, those angled discs that John Deere has runs at a 7-degree angle. When you get side hill drift, the right side of the drill here is running at a 0-degree angle. The left side of the drill is running at about a 14-degree angle. Now, the bad news is the seed press wheel is not directly above the seed row on either side of the drill. And so again, to avoid side hill drift, you need weight on the back of the drill to get the back of that air seeder to bite the ground so it doesn't slide downhill. And I say that because John Deere actually has the weight brackets on the front where it's easier to reach. That's not where they belong. It belongs on the back. A producer friend of mine, actually in Australia, he took his drill, put narrow depth gauge wheels on, squeezed it down to 6 inches. Look how much weight he stacked across the back. Make sure those wheels bite the ground. Josh Lloyd over at Clay Center, Kansas, weights in the back. And again, with folding wings, make sure you get weight out there in the wings. But that's where it belongs. The drill, the air seeder is going to get lifted in back, just the way the rock shaft works. Don't put the weights in the front. Again, here's the Case IH SDX, weights in the back. This is stripper head harvested wheat stubble. He's out there planting into it. Again, he's got weights across the back. This is a 30-foot drill with 36 front end weights across the back of that drill. This producer did the math and says, I need more weight. And again, do that math problem. And one reason you needed the weight is the seed is no longer carried on the frame of the drill. The drill itself is pretty lightweight, so you need to add the weight. He does some custom work. You can see the cast iron weights in the back. He's added water tanks to his drill. And the water tanks is when he gets into a field for doing custom work that doesn't have good soil structure yet. He needs extra weight for penetration. Now, they're staggered there, one in front of the other. When it folds up, they're all three in a line. You can't fold it with the water in there. He's got quick connectors. He takes the 600 gallons of water out into a water tanker and then folds it up and gets to the next field. If he needs the weight, puts the water back in the tanks. If he doesn't need the weight, don't do it. Then you don't have excessive compaction. But the other thing is, it makes that drill a lot safer in transport down the road because he just took 600 gallons of water out of there. You have to handle that weight safely. Again, we've got some people looking at 15-inch wheat, half as many openers, half as much weight. And I can spend more money on the openers. This is actually a 15-inch wheat planter with a Kinsey planter that is set up for 15-inch spacing. Again, here's 15-inch planter set up where he's got two water tanks on top are just for weight. Fertilizers carrying the front tanks. The front gang of planter units, sand insecticide hoppers. The rear gang of planter units, he's got cast iron back there. But again, look at your own equipment. What do you need to change? And it comes down to it, these 15-inch planters, I love what I call even row planters. With even row planters, you're going to have 2 rows between each of the standing rows of residue. You're going to leave a lot more residue standing. What I hate is the odd row planters because now I got my front set of rows running down my old corn stalks. The rear set of rows is running either in a soft row or a wheel track row. And so I tend toward the even row planters. Closing here, I realize I'm just pushing my hour. Here's the one drill I've not had to add weight to it. The front opener there is a fertilizer opener. It's got anhydrous cold flow, it's got liquid, it's got dry. It's got paired rows. Fertilizer is in the middle of the paired rows and back. And you notice rollers up front. That's a track system that rolls up and down. There's hydraulic cylinders pushing down on each set of openers. Now, put some scale to it. The front discs are 20 to 24 inch, depending on which option you buy. The rear discs are 24 to 30 inch, depending on which option you buy and how deep you want to plant. Yes, that's 12-inch tall wheat stubble standing there. Weight is built in. There's his fertilizer, his anhydrous, dry fertilizer up top. Sell all your tillage equipment, you're going no-till. Sell all your tractors because you're doing one pass. Keep one little tractor to pull it. That 20-foot yielder drill came out of Spokane, Washington. They like pulling it at 8 to 10 mile an hour. That 20-foot drill took about 500 horse to pull it at 10 mile an hour. At 8 mile an hour, you get by about 350. Now, you'll say that's huge. They targeted 10,000 acre producers. You plant spring wheat, corn, milo, soybeans, sunflowers, winter wheat. Choose about 6 to 8 crops you can grow in your area and market. Now, 20-foot wide at 10 mile an hour with 6 or 8 crops you're planting. Your planting season is so long that one planter or one drill, one tractor, one operator can cover 10,000 acres. On a per acre system is the cheapest farming system I've ever seen. And Yielder made a bunch of those drills. Now, you're looking at that and say, holy cow. That drill in 1983, when I took this picture, was $180,000, $240,000 with all the options for 20-foot wide. But divide by 10,000 acres, that's $24 an acre. One man. Cheap system. Now, just like you're looking at that, I had one old timer raise his hand and said, I'm no-tilling for $60. I said, $60? What attachment did you buy? Nope, 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 nope. The planter was $60 on a farm sale. He says that planter can't cut the first stick of residue, don't plant on the old row. Can't penetrate the wheel track, don't plant in the wheel track. His systems approach was to conservation. This is one of those guys I worked with there in the 80s, where 1985 Conservation Compliance said I had to have erosion under control. And the only place he had to do no-till according to his conservation plan was no-till into soybean residue. He thought about the steps, and that old runner planter could do it. His conservation system included alfalfa rotation, included terraces, included waterways. Again, his systems approach. And so again, you got to start thinking systems approach. How does it all fit together? With that, quick commercial for Crop Watch, our crop production, crop scouting newsletter at University of Nebraska. It's also our extension portal to everything that we have for crop recommendations. With that, I am right at my hour.
Well done, Paul. I've got the audience here. Are there any questions? Okay, everybody's real quiet.
I'll refer you to David Doctorian. He's seen my presentation several times. And in fact, he had a field day a couple of years ago where I took his planter and screwed it up, where we could show where misadjustment made the difference. But one of the things, like I say, well-structured no-till soil, things start to behave different. The longer you're in continuous no-till, the more soil biology is working with you, and you're not working against residue. You're trying to figure out how to get more residue out there. So make a continuous no-till, and it becomes a lot easier.
Love it. I like those parting remarks. I'll be able to, I've already shared my information with everyone. So if there's any follow-up questions, I'll send them to you. And rest assured, we did have your handout here on tables, so everyone was able to follow along to those points.
All right, that sounds good.
Right. Thank you for adjusting with us.
I did have one more, I guess. Area review of the Rogers Memorial Farm, but there's my email up in the corner if someone wants to send me a note.
Sounds wonderful. So we'll let you go and get well, and thank you for joining us.
All right, thank you.
Okay, we'll take another, well, we're gonna head outside now. Lindsay and Lynn are gonna lead. We have the warm season cover crop plot in. They've been working on that, so I'll let them give any directions we need with that. That'll be, we'll finish up at the plot and then we'll come back up here for supper. And when we come back up here, we'll do our door prize drawings. So you still have time if you haven't turned in your papers, if you want to be part of it, they can just be set up front.